Thanks very much for coming along, everybody. Love to see the rangatahi here as well. I think there's a couple of... We met at the end of last year, I think. Sorry the council didn't buy the story. We'll work on that. It's another story. To extend, I guess, on Harley's introduction, over the last year and a half, about a year and a half ago, I formed a view that I probably didn't want to be doing exactly the same thing for the next chunk of time. Dug deep into my soul to figure out what would be a more better outcome, and decided that I could probably play a role in climate change in New Zealand, that was a marriage of an area I was passionate about, which is environment and sustainability, and also the understanding of the markets, the economics of the change that is needed. So I didn't know what that looked like, but the first thing I did was pull together a national diagnostic. So if New Zealand was to actually respond to this climate thing, whatever that is, what would that mean? You know, what would be the most pragmatic, the least painful path to doing that? And I want to share where I've got to with you on that. That thing became what's now known as the 1.5 project, which is a not-for-profit backed by Stephen Tyndall and a few other very generous souls. And the role we are playing in the ecosystem is to focus and amplify the voices of people that are pursuing a 1.5 future. So today's conversation will be about the focus bit of that, and maybe we can even talk about how we might then amplify the voices of those interested later on. This is, I hope, not going to be a monologue, so please do feel free to jump in and ask any questions as we go, and I'll sort of pause after each slide. I've got about 10-ish slides to chew through. What I want to talk about today is, at the moment, we really have no meaningful action on climate change in New Zealand at central government level or at local government level. That said, there is a risk that there might be action in the not too distant future. And so today's discussion is not going to be about the risk of inaction, sort of think polar bears and sea level rise and storms, but it's the risk of action, and it's the risk of action to the stuff that we do every day and what might change if we actually start to align with the science. So there's three parts to this story. The first bit is the science, and I'm going to give you a very, very brief whistle-stop tour through the science. Then there's the words. I'm going to talk about the words in two flavours, what the economics people call the capital markets, which is sort of investors, and the other side is the legislation, the emerging legislation around this. And the third is the action. What are we actually doing? So at the moment, the science is really, really clear. Like, if you had to fall asleep in a minute, I'll tell you the summary story. The science is really clear that we should not allow the planet to exceed 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial level surface temperature. The words are sort of 1.5 with wiggle room if you're a politician to maybe not do as much as you might like. The action, however, is more like 3 degrees at the moment in New Zealand, and globally is probably a bigger number. So the question is, what would happen if they all line up? So I'm going to step through each of those bullets and end up with the punchline of what action might look like. So for a start, it's like a big topic. But there's a guy called John Cook who's managed to boil it down to 10 words, which is awesome. So he has said, it is real. So climate change is actually happening. Secondly, it is us. It is not volcanoes. It is not COVID. It is not any bunch of a number of other things. It's actually more warming caused by humans than we're seeing. Some of the natural effects are actually cooling it down a little bit. Experts agree. I met with somebody last night who was a grown-up in the finance industry, and they said, just a lot of debate about this climate change, and I sort of mentally just slapped them around the chops. And there is no debate. So the same group undertook a survey, and they've done so over a few years, but last year, of something like 11,000 climate science papers published, and there was 100% alignment with the changes in the climate being caused by human beings, anthropogenic climate change. So nobody in the climate science community disagrees that it's us. It's really bad. I'm going to tip my hat to that. And then obviously that's a depressing story if you get to that point. So you've got to leave someone with there is hope. And there is absolutely hope. There is not hope if we carry on doing what we're doing at the moment. So we must change, and we must change in a way that is greater than is being articulated by anybody in New Zealand at the moment. So I'll bring you down and then I'll bring you back up, okay? So David Wallace Wells is an author, is a journalist. In 2017, he worked for, and still works for, a magazine called The New Yorker magazine, and he observed a lot of things coming across his desk that sounded bad from the scientific community. But he noticed that no one had really brought this stuff together. So he did so, and he published that in his first article called The Uninhabitable Earth. And overnight, it became the most read article in the New Yorker magazine, and it just created a firestorm. It was subsequently updated, and you get both versions online, with a sort of a scientist's rebuke or commentary where the scientist felt he had overplayed the science. But all of that is transparent. So it got such a positive response that the owners of the publication said, David, please go away and sit in a cabin by a lake somewhere and write us a book about this, which we all want to happen to us, right? So he went away for 2 years and published a book in January of last year, and it rocketed to the top of the New York Times bestselling list. Same name. The opening sentence for both of those, the article and the book, is, "It is worse, much worse than you think." And that's a really, it's an emotive term, and I sort of tried to keep, to the extent possible, to the science that's validated. But the reason I'm now comfortable saying this is because we ran a survey, the 1.5 Project ran a survey. We brought research from George Mason and Yale University to New Zealand to see where New Zealanders were at. We also ran it in Auckland to understand climate sentiment. And there's a bunch of questions, and it basically puts people in a continuum between Donald Trump and Greta, and you know, a number of segments in between. And to the question, when do you think that climate change will harm human beings, the average New Zealander thinks that that is 30 years from now. The same survey ran in Australia 2 years ago was slightly better. The Australians, embarrassingly, were slightly more onto it than us, and they said it was about 26 years from now. But that if you believe that the fires in Australia represent harm to human beings, and if you think about the weather events that bookended those fires, there's a fundamental disconnect between the average New Zealander and Australian and the science. So I'm really now very comfortable saying that if I was to pick a group in an average room, this is not an average room because you've turned up, but in an average room, it is worse than you think. So which begs the question, how hot should we go? 4 is better than 5, 3 is better than 2, 2 is better than 3. The Paris Accord, which you may have heard about, set a structure where countries should go no more than 2 degrees of average surface temperature rise, and ideally as close to 1.5. And a bunch of countries said, well, we're going to be underwater at 2 degrees. Could you do some work on that? And so they went away for 2.5 years and they did some work. They published it in October 2018. And the punchline was, you really, really, really want to stay at 1.5 if you can get away with it. And that's because a whole bunch of different levels of badness come into play as you move between 1.5 and 2. But one of the transitionings, or one of the main reasons that you would stay below 1.5 is tipping points. So these tipping points are sudden and irreversible in a human timescale things. So they are reversible in 100,000 years. They are not reversible in tens or hundreds of years. And the challenge with these tipping points, and these are the ones that are noted, this is a publication from end of 2019, and they are related. So one thing tips, think dominoes. One thing tips, next thing tips, next thing tips. And there's a bunch of them. The coral reefs is kind of an independent one. It's mainly in Australia. There is coral elsewhere as well. At 2 degrees, there is a 99% chance of them dying off. There's now a low chance, extremely low chance, that the coral will survive. And that has consequences, for the ecosystem all up and down that coast. But there's 3 other I wanted to draw your attention to. The first is down the bottom, the West Antarctic ice shelf. That represents 3 metres of sea level rise. That may have already tipped. Now, it hasn't melted yet, but we may have already released enough heat into the atmosphere for that to have moved into a period of decline irreversible on those human timescales. If not, it is most likely that tip happens before 1.5 degrees. It has a big sister called the Greenland ice shelf, which represents 7 metres of sea level rise. Same story, may have already gone already, most probably will go by 1.5. So collectively that's 10 metres of sea level rise. That won't happen in decades. We're probably talking 100 to a plus years. But the point to note is it will be irreversible. 10 metres of sea level rise would probably be quite awkward here, I would guess. The other one that is worth noting is sort of the middle of this is the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon rainforest is a regulator. It's been described as the lungs. It accounts for, depending on which story you believe, somewhere between 6 and 10% of the oxygen created on the planet. A study was undertaken and published 3 months ago by 200 scientists who, with a tape measure, measured 135,000 trees in Africa and the Amazon. And the purpose of this was to understand the impact of increasing carbon levels, CO2 levels. CO2 is good for a while and then it gets bad. It actually facilitates growth for a while and then it sort of turns around. Their midpoint estimate for the Amazon, the bit that is not touched, so not through deforestation, is that it will shift from being a sink of carbon, absorbing carbon, to being a source of carbon releasing about 2034. So you end up, at least from a climate absorption perspective, the functional collapse of the Amazon within 10, 15 years. There's a very wide range on that. So the earlier ranges are somewhere in the 20s, kind of this decade, and it could be several decades after that. But it is a structural shift. So this is why 1.5 really matters, and this is why we should do everything as a planet to not go beyond 1.5. And the other point I'll raise is that this is also the health professionals. So before that was kind of the bearded cardigan wearing climate scientists, but the medical fraternity as well, who are applied scientists, is saying the same thing. And I guess the argument they're pulling together is really one around equity, and that this is going to absolutely smash those who can least do anything about it. So Tātau, which is an umbrella for a lot of these, have said climate change poses a serious threat to health, well-being and fairness, both globally and Aotearoa. Furthermore, its impacts are not distributed equally. Maori, Pacific and low-income groups are at greater risk of experiencing poor outcomes due to climate change. They're actually, that thing down the bottom, net zero gas emissions by 24, is actually even slightly less than 1.5. So they're arguing a 1.5 world through a health lens. And then there's the words. So that's the science. So the science is really clear on 1.5. If you then look at the words, so the top bit there, Bank of England and the Financial Stability Board, the Financial Stability Board was pulled together presumably to maintain financial stability in about 2009, and it was chaired by a guy called Mark Carney. Mark was also the Governor of the Bank of England, and he's been very, very vocal on this. He has said, and I will get the quote here if I can find my non-sustainable post-it note, carbon emissions have to decline by 45% from 2010 levels over the next decade in order to reach net zero by 2050. This requires a massive reallocation of capital. If some companies and industries fail to adjust to this new world, they will fail to exist. The reason that matters is because this is the owners of the investment at the top end of the stack. And there are parties, and this is washing down from Europe, where behind the eight ball, America, no one knows what America's doing at the moment, but it is coming. So they're very clear that we should be staying at 1.5. What I just read to you is code for 1.5. The New Zealand government and Auckland Council in particular are playing a leadership role. So the New Zealand government has said, put in place a Zero Carbon Bill, Zero Carbon Act. Purpose of the bill is to establish a framework that New Zealand can use to develop clear and stable policies, blah, 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 limit average temperature increase to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. So that's the purpose of the Act. Forget about the targets that are in there. The purpose of the Act is about 1.5. Auckland Council has committed now to a 50% reduction across the whole region, not just the council rubbish trucks and cars, across the whole region. That's also a 1.5 compliant plan. So those two actors, and Auckland is a big economic part of the country, are about to go through a transformation that even they have not twigged on yet, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And then there's the youth, and it has been amazing what the youth have been doing. It's raising the voice. It has been noticed, and I think what we're now seeing is some of the grown-ups are observing that. I spoke with a guy called Sir Jonathan Porritt, who is a considered very English-speaking academic and an experienced voice in this space. And his view was, look, we're actually moving away from a world where it's about reports, and we're moving towards a world of civil disobedience, and so much so that he is actually rediverting his actions to supporting civil disobedience. So we're going to see, if you believe that's going to happen, then the sort of behaviour we saw out of Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace over the years, Sea Shepherd, if you've been aware of what they're doing, you ain't seen nothing yet, is what is increasingly a consideration, and the politicians will eventually notice that. So the words are moving towards 1.5, but there's a bit of wiggle room, in particular for the Ministry for the Environment. Really faint. I'm not sure what's going on there. So if you then look at the action, so there are a number of people that pull together the policies of the different countries to assess how close we are towards a 1.5 or whatever future. At the moment, we're at about roughly 1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that's kind of this line here. The 1.5 I've been banging on about is here. So the Paris range is sort of here. Depending on how you look at the various promises, the world is on track for a plan somewhere between 2.3 and 4.4, with a middling view of around 3 degrees at the moment. So you get variability across countries. I haven't included it here, but if you look at a country-wide level, we are in exactly the same group as a country called Australia, which is embarrassing because we think of the narrative around Australia as them being a long way behind, and I think in terms of the legislation and the narrative, they are. But in terms of the action, we're actually, at a policy level, we're not any better than them, really. We're in the same, we're a little bit better, but not that much better. We're still in the insufficient, as it's defined by Climate Action Tracker, which is a consortium of universities who kind of boil this stuff together. So, in short, we're a really long way away from Paris at the moment. The action is in no way aligned with the words. But what would happen if they did line up? What would happen if the science and the words and the action actually got together? And what I'll argue now is that, make a quote from Bad Boys, but it will get real very, very fast, I think. One of the reasons, and I haven't got a slide to this, but one of the reasons is, and this is a bit pointy-headed, the Zero Carbon Act came in last year. It was agreed by all but one politician. It had very wide support. And the Nats came in about an hour and a half afterwards and said, yeah, but it's too hard on the farmers, so we're going to back that off. But it did have broad support as a construct. And one of the things that got snuck through in the dead of night without anybody noticing was a little group called the Climate Change Commission. And the Climate Change Commission is a group of 6 scientists, climate scientists, who are obliged to provide recommended carbon budgets for New Zealand on 3 5-year periods from 2021. Now, the government is not obliged they're obliged to receive them, they're obliged to respond, and they're obliged to set their own budgets next year. But they're not obliged to actually do what the Climate Change Commission recommends. But there's a couple of things at play in there that could change this, and I think with my hopeful hat on will. The first is the Climate Change Commission will provide a recommendation which is based on the science. It needs to consider other things, but it needs to be a science-compliant view. Then, if you look at what's happening in government, if the Greens get in, and this remains a question, I mean, anything could happen in the next few months. If the Greens get in, it's highly likely that one of their terms will be whatever the Climate Change Commission says the government has to do. So you then end up with a science-driven recommendation which the government is obliged to accept. If that happens, then it's all on. And I'll just talk to you in a moment about what it's all on could look like. So I've got a couple of slides of maths. There's not too much maths here, but A big question is, how much do our emissions have to decline by in order for us to align with this 1.5 world? If you take, and this is just, both sides of this chart are copy-paste, extensive use of copy-paste. The top bit is a copy-paste out of the IPCC's summary for policymakers for the 1.5 from 2018. And it said in model pathways, so that's the sort of decline curves, with no or limited overshoot of 1.5, so we don't blow through 1.5 and sort of come back, we sort of smooth off at 1.5. Net anthropogenic, people cause CO2 emissions decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. So if you believe that, then for New Zealand, that's about a 54% reduction from 2017 levels-ish. So we would have to reduce our emissions by about 54% from, call it now-ish, it's actually slightly more, which is why I landed about 60%. It's only as low as 60% if you believe two things. One is you have to believe that very large-scale carbon capture and storage machines exist at scale sometime in the 2030s. Like, think really, really, really big air conditioning units, and a lot of them. They don't exist yet. The second thing you have to believe is that New Zealand will do no more than the average. So as a wealthy nation that has benefited from emissions over a long period of time, there is an argument that we should decarbonise faster. And in fact, New Zealand under the Paris Accord has committed to doing so. But let's just ignore those two bits. Let's assume that these machines turn up from somewhere in 2035, and let's assume that we don't do more than the average, in which case it's only a 54% reduction from 2017. So looking through the numbers, the 2018 numbers are out now, but they're so similar that I haven't even bothered updating them. 81 million tonnes of gross emissions goes into the air, of which 24 is soaked up by the trees, largely thanks to a planting boom in the 90s. Net emissions, that leaves, so that amount, 24 less, 81 less 24 gives you 57 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions that go into the atmosphere to warm up the planet. In order to take 54% out by 2030, we need to pull about 31 million tonnes out to get back to a run rate, annualised, it's not even annualised, it's a path to zero, but of 26 by 2030. So that's the sort of rough scale. There's uncertainties around this, but for the next part of the conversation, I'll be talking about finding, a little bit like looking down the back of the couch, the 30 to 35 million tonnes of emissions reductions that the country needs to pull together. This is accounted for under UNFCCC rules, which is sort of the UN Global Agreement of Carbon Accounting. As an artefact of history, and I believe a very heavy involvement from the Saudis a long, long time ago, the way it is accounted for is for making products or making things, the carbon is counted where the thing is made. So drying baby milk, for example, is accounted for here. And where the fuels are burnt is accounted for in this country as well. So what that means is that where we account for those things, we do not account for, within these numbers, the carbon associated with the TV you just bought, the car you just bought. That is picked up in the country it is made. And what that means is you can add up the numbers of all the countries and it should equal the amount of emissions that are going into the planet. There's two things that manage to sneak out of this in the dead of night and kind of don't fit under the Paris Accord. One is global aviation. That accounts for, in New Zealand accounting, about 2 to 3 million additional to this. And the other one is global maritime, offshore maritime shipping. And I saw those numbers and I think they're similar, if not slightly smaller, burning bunker fuel. So what that means is the offshore shipping and freight more generally is not picked up under the Paris Accord. There is an attempt to do so. And I guess a question is, how does one think about this? At a national level, most countries are aligning for the most part around the stuff that fits in within their camp, whilst also trying to drop, to not waste and to not encourage consumption or emissions from offshore, buying less TV sets, for example, buying less jeans. So they're sort of encouraging that kind of behaviour. I'll dig into that more in a moment.
These figures, these budgets you're talking about, assuming the current state of affairs, like if the Amazon does reach its tipping point from an absorption to an emitter, these figures all change, don't they?
It's a really good point. So these numbers are based on the target changes, the national level, the national numbers change. So this number on the left-hand side would change. The amount we're emitting currently would still be about the same for New Zealand, but that's absolutely the case. So that in one of the notable shortfalls of the 2018 report, which is kind of the Bible for 1.5, is that it did not consider feedback loops. And that is a recognised weakness, which will be updated next year, and will probably mean that these middling targets are way too low. So I would expect that the ratchet will go up in the next 12 to 18 months. Yeah, that's a really good point, is that, and that's under the Himalayan thing, we've already emitted enough for about a third of the glaciers in the Himalayas to melt. They haven't done so yet, but they will. If we carry on, we will lose that. There's 1.5 billion people that feed off that. It's absolutely the case, and in fact, one of the comments to illustrate this, I wasn't going to talk about this now, but I'll just give a quick quote out of the fires. So Australians know how to fight bushfires. Like, they're really good. They're the best in the world at this. Greg Mullins was a former New South Wales fire chief, and he said, we're seeing fire behaviour that we have never seen before. And Shane Fitzsimmons, the New South Wales current fire commissioner, said what we saw on Wednesday was fire behaviour exceeding our worst case scenario. They had not even imagined some of the fire constructs that happened. And we're going to see more of that. So the question now becomes, looking down the back of the couch, how are we going to find the 30 to 35 million tonnes of savings, emission savings? A couple of things I'll say before I get there. First is, you will hear a lot of talk about net zero 2050. It's complete nonsense. It's not about 2050. This battle is won or lost in the next 5 to 10 years, arguably in the next 2 to 5 years. The reason that is the case is because emissions are cumulative. They build up in the atmosphere and just stay in the atmosphere. So it's not the case that you can sort of emit till 2050 and then just turn the lights off and it'll be fine, because you will have emitted a lot. The Productivity Commission did a really good body of work. I mean, it was 655 pages. It was painful to read, but it was a really, really good book with great recommendations. And they considered a bunch of scenarios for a decline for New Zealand. So this is the number, which is about 57 from the previous chart, growing, then declining to various flavours of either net zero by 2050 or a bigger number. They had one scenario, this blue dotted one here, which they called disruptive decarbonisation, that they just put in for a giggle. No one was ever going to do that, but they needed an outlier. And then awkwardly, about 4 weeks after that, the IPCC came out with their curve and said, actually, you've got to follow this line. So that's the number I showed you before. That's the 26, so we're going to pull sort of 31-ish out. People are still referring to the Productivity Commission work, and it is an excellent body of work, but its scenarios are so hopelessly out of date that one should never refer to them. One should also never speak of, this is a little bit like Lord Voldemort, never speak his name. You really, because what it does is create an abdication of responsibility for the now, and it's all about the now. The next bit is emissions are cumulative, as I mentioned. So transition risk build. So this is a Norwegian scientist who said, well, if this is global emissions of CO2, had we started dropping our emissions back in 2000-ish, to stay within 1.5, we would have followed this sort of really gentle curve. Because we basically just bought more Hiluxes and burnt coal, we're now at this point here, roughly 45 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year. So in order to stay below 1.5, the planet needs to decarbonise on the black line. So it is true that we get to sort of net zero 2050, but she's a steep drop. And because emissions are cumulative, if we keep burning through the budget, and roughly speaking, when this was published now a year ago, there was 420 gigatons of budget before 1.5. You know, at 40 gigatons a year, that's 10 years. Then if we carry on globally at the same level, then we basically just have to turn the lights off and go back to the cave in 2030 if we want to stay below 1.5. So it actually gets harder. It gets steeper. And one person I spoke to, a CEO of an energy company, he said to me, it's almost like the blue line is the market. I can do this myself. And the red line is the mandate. And that's when the government starts to get heavy-handed and starts to do stuff that may or may not be awesome. So if you're in that space and if you're an investor in that space, for example, you really want to know that this risk is just building. All you need is a few really big weather events and political sentiment will shift, as we have seen in Australia. I'll quickly talk through where emissions come from. So this is a New Zealand story. 81 million tonnes. This is the chart I showed you before. 81 less 24.57. We've got to find 30 behind the couch to get back to 26. 39 million, half of our emissions come from the agriculture sector, mainly cows, enteric fermentation, methane. 14 of 81 come from road transportation. 8 of that is cars, 6 of that is moving things around with trucks. 7 of 81 is manufacturing industries. This is process heat to make stuff. The biggest actor in there is a company called Fonterra that accounts for about 2.5 million of the 7 using coal, mainly, and a smidgen of gas in the South Island to dry milk. In addition to that, you have Methanex, which no one's ever heard of, but they make methanol for export. You know, think big industrial things with big sort of Simpson-style smokestacks. Industrial process and product use is slightly different. This is steel and aluminium and glass, and the reason it's different is because it's a side effect of the chemistry of the production process. The first one is you can just put in an electric boiler, you know, and if it's solar powered, awesome. We can't make steel chemically using the current method without releasing CO2. So the reason that matters is it's a lot harder to change than the other one. Energy industries, this is 5 of 81. 4 of those are the electricity sector, coal and gas, Huntley and somewhere else. And 1 is the energy to make petrol and diesel in Whangarei. 4 of 81 is waste. This is landfill, methane landfill. And then you end up with the other, which always ends up being bigger than the smallest category, annoyingly. But the big players in there are fugitive gases. So that's 2 of 7. This is literally leaky gas pipes and flaring by the oil and gas industry that really doesn't manage this at all well. And in the US in particular, underreports it quite a lot. If we underreport in a manner similar to the States, it's probably not 2, it's probably 10, which means that it's bigger than all of the coal we're burning in the country. So the story that gas is a transition is a fairy tale. Aviation in New Zealand is about 0.8 or 0.9 of 81, so it'd be better not to have it, but it's 1% of total emissions in New Zealand. And then you've got miscellaneous, the rats and mice, you've got the forestry fleet, you've got offshore vehicles, farm vehicles, for example, you've got the local maritime, I think trains are in there, real rats and mice. Right. So that's where they come from. So the question then becomes, how are you going to make up? You've got to basically take 30 to 35 million out of this lot here. So how are you going to do that? And what I'm going to show is what I consider after a year's worth of, and I've spoken to about 2,000 or 3,000 people on this, about 2,500 people. And this is not the right answer, and I would love someone to prove that it's wrong, but it has stood the test of quite a few angry conversations. So if I start at the beginning, I think we'll have a cost of carbon, so we'll probably pull out, the leaky gas pipes, we'll seal them off. It's not that hard. BP has said that they will do that. Excuse me. So that'll give us 1 to 2. Waste will manage that better. It will shift from methane being just spat out into the atmosphere to being burned as part of a cycle, or to aerobic composting. So we pulled 3 of 4 out. Energy industries, coal and gas for intra and inter-day kind of short period electricity will increasingly be challenged by renewables, solar's cost curve which keeps coming down, and batteries whose economics are changing faster than anybody thought. We will still probably have some coal and gas in 2030, but we probably might have it gone by 2035. So that's 3 gone. Industrial process and product uses of steel and aluminium. There is no desire to close Glenbrook, for example, 4,500 jobs and $100 million of GDP in the region. So unlikely, you can't fix it. If you're going to build a new one, you would build it somewhere else. So on the assumption that we keep it, I've sort of said, let's just sneak a bit of efficiency out of it. Manufacturing industries and construction, this is the process heat. It's going to have to be really expensive before we turn off a lot of the process heat. There's no indication that the ETS is going to give us big numbers yet. Maybe it will, and this, I could be wrong on this one, in which case this is one area where I may have undercooked it. But I said that in 2030, Fonterra is no longer drying baby milk with coal. And they're working very, very hard to change that now. It's not that easy, but they've got a decade, and if they don't do so, I would argue their social license to operate, which is already under much duress, is gone. We're also seeing other jurisdictions, notably Europe, who are starting to effectively talk about import barriers to high carbon products. If you make high carbon products, you do not sell your products. So that's got us 9 to 12 of our 30 to 35 million. The 1 billion trees program, if I put my really optimistic face on, it's 5. It's not 5. If I put my quite optimistic face on, it's 3. The government has guesstimated it's 1.5. It depends on whether it's purakawa or a pine, and it depends on whether they actually get planted. But I started this and I thought we could plant our way out of this, and it turns out you have to plant a lot of trees to get out of this. So it's a good addition. It's sort of a 1 to 3 number. I've assumed 3 to 5 here. One of the important points to note as well is that it does assume that the 24 here kind of stays 24. We keep absorbing it. That's not the case. There is a volley of tree felling that is anticipated over the next while that will change that number. But again, I've put my optimistic face on for this.
Well, what's the carbon price need to look like for those market-driven changes?
I've assumed 0 carbon price except for the top one. So if you look at what's driven by them, I've assumed because these are low cost, assume it's, if you look at what's happening, it's almost the social license to operate that has driven the action out of BP because it's so low cost to fix. So that gives you the gas. You're seeing the councils who drive waste in New Zealand increasingly under their own steam are migrating to a different waste system. The economics of alternatives is changing energy, not much change there, and this is really a social license to operate story. So I haven't actually assumed any carbon cost. I think those, if there is, then the numbers just get pushed up, and most notably this one here gets pushed up. You'll get more out of your process heat. But again, there's only 7 there out of 81, so you can only get so much out of it. So there's another 3.5 if I'm optimistic. Agriculture, the zero carbon bill has a formal target, a 4% reduction in methane by 2030. I have assumed we get that across all ag emissions. As I said before, National came out an hour and a half after that this was signed and said it's too hard on the farmers, so we're going to push it down. So and it is hard. Like, it is really actually hard to change the cows basically in a decade. In addition, the farming community is currently saddled with about $85 billion worth of debt, and transforming from anything to anything else is hard. But and I'll pick the ridiculous example, and I'll get pulled up on this, but let's say you wanted to become a kiwi fruit grower, then you've got to clear your land, generate no cash, hang around for 7 years until your trees actually bear fruit before you start paying the bank back. It's unlikely the bank's going to see the funny side of that story. So you end up with this transition challenge across that sector in particular. There are emergent things that might help, and seaweed is usually the one that comes in most notably, is that there is seaweed experimentation that's going on that reduces the methane per cow. It may work. I don't know that I would bet the planet on it. And therefore, I sort of think that we should assume roughly 4 out of that. But what that means is you've got about 20 of your 30 to 35 out of those, pulling those levers, some of them somewhat hard. If you believe that, then you actually need to entirely decarbonise road transportation by 2030. So you need to make petrol and diesel functionally extinct by 2030. And the way I think of this now is we need to prepare for a world that is resilient, because on the 1st of January 2031, there will be no more petrol. And so if that's the case, how do I prepare my business, my life, for that new world? So that's obviously really awkward for many industries. If we talk briefly about why this might be wrong. So it might be wrong because the government just continues to not take action. And if that's the case, then just carry on, and we'll just wait until the disaster movie turns up. That the science tells us will come eventually. This will change. It will change because we act or because we don't act. And society will change for one of those two reasons. So thing one is, maybe we don't go for that 30 to 35. There is a scenario actually where it's bigger than that, but let's disregard that for a moment. The other one is maybe the mix is a little bit different here. These categories are pretty small. It's hard to pull that much more out of them. The two big candidates that you might change a lot. One is you might plant a lot of trees. So the Productivity Commission advocated about 2.5 billion trees. The Billion Trees program is actually only about 450 million trees in a political sleight of hand. So you could plant 5 times more trees than are currently anticipated. But that also gets quite awkward. We're already having some pretty testy conversations around land use in New Zealand today, and we're only 10% of the way through that. Doing 5x is hard.
Just a question on that. What about predator-free 2050 they talk about?
Yep.
Say we did that earlier.
Yep.
We actually eliminated possums from browsers.
Yeah, and cats.
What effect would that have on these emissions?
Yeah, I think that's still an emergent area, and I would say there's still emergent science around the carbon capture and storage potential of native versus pine, and the ecosystems associated with that, and possums are a part of that. So I think it's a positive story, and I love the project that's going on up to the north around making that, regenerating that stand of wood. But it's not clear to me how material that would actually be. So you might plant a lot more trees, in which case your 1.5 to 3 might become 5-ish. You've really annoyed a lot of people at that point. You could solve it overnight by allowing the cattle to die. So you don't have to kill them, but you just don't replace them. And again, that's absolutely possible technically, but it's a hard conversation. The other one that could happen, this is an area which has only recently become evident to me after some recent numbers were related, is we could make it, for some in the audience this is going to be a hard thing to say, but we could make it illegal to fell trees. So at the moment we have 24 million tonnes being absorbed by the trees. The curve takes us down to, on the predicted cutting pattern through the next decade, down to about 8 per year. Now it could be at a global level that the economics of carbon sequestration become so compelling that forestry owners are paid to not cut the trees down at massive scale. And clearly that's a consideration in this region, quite some. That's what I would call a technically possible solution. it's not clear to me how that might play out. Sorry.
Yeah, just on that, you sort of essentially forestry owners are already starting to be paid to keep their trees in the ground. We've got an issue arising about carbon, what's the word, sequestration.
Yeah.
We had someone talk in here to the councillors recently about that and wall wood and things. If you leave trees in the ground, you're inevitably going to get so many more environmental issues, because pine trees don't last forever in New Zealand, unless you look at planting redwoods or something that's longer term. It's just so crazy. And then you talk about kiwi fruit overtaking farms, but then where are you going to get the water from for irrigation?
Yeah. I think there's, I talk about this path as being the least hard path. Like anything we do is going to be hard in a way that society has never seen before. This has been likened to World War II, but of a bigger scale in terms of the rate of change, but a bigger scale. And that is poorly understood by most, even those that should know better. I'll just quickly ask the question around what this might mean for this region here. So if I was to say, what would it look like for us to stay within this camp? It's really, a lot of our emissions actually come from ag here. It's going to be hard to fix that faster. You could move ag out of the region, but I wouldn't take that much out of there. I think there is a story here about forestry, what the economics of forest, like a transformation in the way that nobody seems to be currently thinking about in forestry, which might be beneficial for the region. And I think road transportation, we have to assume, the story I told you before is national, therefore it's here as well. You have to assume that petrol and diesel is not for sale on the 1st of January 2031. And how do it's not going to be the case, you still better drive the Cortina, but you've got to be able to assume, you need to get yourself in a frame of mind where, even from a resilience perspective, what would it take, what has to be true in order for us to move away from the current paradigm. Yeah, and I think what a lot of the for this region, because of the forestry and also because of the focus of ag here, there's probably a short-term 10-year tree story, but there's a longer-term use of land story. And clearly that comes into, as you mentioned there, water. Water is going to become a massive issue here in ways that don't seem to be being addressed adequately from what I'm seeing the outside in. I won't go into this, but I will just make the comment that done this work, the conclusion is you've got to decarbonise transportation. We're currently working on decarbonising Auckland completely because they have signed up to a 50% reduction. They need to, because they've got no space for new trees, they've got no cows, they actually have to do the transportation thing. I pulled together an analysis of what was currently being spent on transport. It's about $20 billion over a decade. It increases the emissions by about 40% by 2030. And I presented this to the head of Auckland Transport that's responsible for such things and the head of the councillor that's in charge of the investment program in the last few weeks, and also the board of New Zealand Transport Authority. These parties did not know that there was a fundamental disconnect between the Zero Carbon Act and the action plans that are underway at the moment. And in actual fact, in Auckland, for example, you need to pull about a third of the cars off the road. You need to massively reinvest for bikes. Like, you need to hand over, call it a third of the road to bikes and buses and walking. And Mike Hoskins, I'm not going to be happy about that. And so I think that what a prevailing message, and I would guess it's here, is that people simply haven't done this thinking, and therefore they kind of think about the increment and the direction, but not the scale and the rate of change. And I would really encourage people in this area to start thinking about the scale and rate of change that might happen to get on the front foot so that we're actually doing this as a region for what's right for the region, rather than reacting to it because the political sentiment has shifted so fast that a rule comes out that all trees must be kept, for example, and which is great that you guys have come along for the story. And that, with a drum roll, that's actually the end of what I wanted to talk about today. Any questions or comments or anything else you wanted to pick up? Thing one, and this is underestimated, and it's particularly underestimated by the youth, vote. Vote. Like, and get your friends to vote, and get your brother to vote, and vote. Like, that is the most important thing to do. So if you abdicate that responsibility, then you're not contributing in the way you could. Secondly, talk to people who are not in your bubble. So most of us, and our research shows this, is people who care a lot about the climate, talk a lot about the climate. I do. Oh, boring, man. So boring to talk to. But I talk mainly with, and all of us do, the research tells us, we talk to other people who agree with us. Stop doing that shit. Like, it feels good in the short term, but it's not changing anything. So get outside your bubble and talk. And this actually is it's in some ways related to research out of Germany after World War II, is there was a reluctance to talk about the growth of Nazism. There was a societal pressure against that. And people didn't, and I think because of the numbers, and those who really care about this are seen as sort of maybe the tie-dyed crazies still a bit, that's changing. But get out and talk respectfully. Not so much the angry yelling across and spitting across the table at somebody else, but try to understand the other. The farming community is a classic case. This is really hard for the farming community. Like, they really, they're just, and you guys know that, it's just families that want to do what, and they've been forced into this by government for 2 decades, and now the rules have changed. So respectful conversations. The third thing is get petrol and diesel out of your life is the general story. We need to cause that industry to collapse in the next 5 to 10 years. That's really so I think, and what that means is that you really need to focus on the things you can do. Planting trees is awesome, and I love trees, but it's really hard to move the dial at a personal level with trees. Similarly, one of the biggest disconnects is recycling and plastic, and no one wants to see plastic around a turtle. But it doesn't actually change the climate story. So I would really encourage you to focus on the things that you can change. The fourth for experts is get disobedient. And that's really just to connect, the extent to which you want to turn up at the school strikes versus gluing yourself to a window somewhere. The numbers are really clear. This is a fossil fuel story at a global level. So this is a coal and it's an oil and gas story. Accounts for about 80%. It is the case that the ag sector contributes to that, but at a global level, we need to shut down oil, gas, and coal like real quick. And this is it's an awkward part of the conversation because it's really good to do that. My partner has gone waste-free, and it is awesome and amazingly painful to watch what that involves. And there's just hours and hours of getting stuff that's not in plastic from a little shop, at the end of time, and I wonder whether her efforts might be spent somewhere else. I tried to have that conversation, didn't go anywhere, but that's for me the question is, where can I have the most impact? And it's not that's a really good thing to do, and what she's doing is actually great. It's the leadership we need. But try to keep in mind the things that you're doing and how are they going to move the dial. And your voice is the most important thing. Your voice is the most important thing. Absolutely, and I think that does, and that's to get petrol and diesel out of your life. I think that does matters a lot. And what we saw through the COVID drama was a transformation of our urban areas that illustrated the possible. So we know that we can travel less. We know that we can live more locally, and we know we can spend more time with active transport, as an example. So we as a people are not without power, but we need to absolutely use it. The other thing I think, and this is what we're focusing on now, is there are individuals who are making decisions that are in favour or against this. Those individuals are the central government, and the individuals are the ministers of the various ministries. They are the councillors of our areas and the mayors of our areas. Identify them and talk to them. send them a text, find out what their their messages is, and when they're having a meeting, send them a text that says, we want you to act more aggressively on this. And make it clear that those decision makers have to make a decision that is actually the right decision for society in the long term, not the now decision, but the multi-generational story. I'm mindful of time here. I'm happy to keep talking, but I don't want to...
What is your thought in relation to connect to what you were saying about...
Yeah. So I mean, to bottom up, top down, I think they're both valid approaches, and the debate is always, where do you affect the most change? To the lifestyle point, it appears to me, and it appears to many, that we are going to have to transform, or going to transform because we did not do anything our lifestyles anyway. And consumerism is a voice of that. The other, I guess, element of this does require state intervention. And that state intervention starts to challenge the economic model we have at the moment. And we're going to end up with a much heavier hand of the state, and I don't think the private sector has twigged on that yet. People's response to this, once they understand it, could be described as a fight, flight, or freeze response. And I think part of the freeze is you don't think you can kind of do anything. I don't agree with that. I think we've seen change. We've seen changes over the last 100 years. Slavery was a great thing for a while, and then it wasn't. Little girl in a bus, in the States, other states. Change does happen. Apartheid. It's awkward and it's messy. But if the people choose to actually create a voice, change will happen. We know what to do. What to do is not hard, but the decision makers are not doing it. If we are not getting the action out of the government we have, get a new government. Change the councillors. If you don't like the councillors, get new councillors. Get active. So I think it's not easy. It's going to be hard. It's going to be harder than anything that society has done before, at least New Zealand society in modern day times. But we are not without influence. But you have to take the bull by the horns and decide you're going to go out of the comfort zone and try to influence. It's a slow awakening of society. That's right, which we're trying to accelerate this now. It's not easy because there are many other issues, and people often look at other issues as being their primary. So, for example, those who care about climate, a small amount care about it the most, but poverty, housing, income, come in pretty close, and often are more pivotal. Understandably, if you haven't got a house or it's a shit house, then it's hard to get all worried about emissions in 2029. So which then comes back into your a much bigger, probably wine-based conversation about the structure of society. I might wrap up now so people can leave if they need to, and if there's a desire to actually carry on conversation, then please, I'm happy to stay here. I've got an innings with the councillors at 2:00, so I'm around until then. Thank you. Thanks for coming.